It's 2013 in a cave near the Red Sea, and a French archaeologist is holding a fragment of papyrus that is about to rewrite everything you think you know about the pyramids. His hands are shaking, not from the desert heat, because the ink in front of him, 4,500 years old, is a diary. A work diary, written by a man who was actually there. His name was Mir, and for one summer, in the 27th year of the reign of a pharaoh named Khufu, Mir wrote down, day by day, exactly how he and his crew moved 2.5-ton blocks of stone across Egypt without a single wheel. No cranes, no trucks, no aliens, just water, rope, and 40 men who had done this so many times it had become routine. You've probably heard the wheel excuse before. How could they have built the pyramids without wheels? It gets repeated in comment sections like it's some unsolvable riddle, like the ancient Egyptians were missing a piece of technology so basic that its absence proves something sinister: extraterrestrials, lost civilizations, secret machines erased from history. But here's what researchers actually found buried in the sand at Wadi al-Jarf. The wheel was never the missing piece. It was never even the right question. Because a wheel is useless on soft desert sand. A wheel sinks. A wheel needs a hard, flat road, and Egypt, for 1,500 years ago, had neither roads nor the metal axles to make wheels worth the effort. What Egypt had instead was a river, the longest one on Earth. And the people who built the pyramids didn't need to reinvent motion. They needed to master water, weight, and friction. And it turns out they mastered all three so completely that modern engineers are only now catching up to how they did it. So forget the wheel. Forget the aliens. What you're about to hear is the real story, and it starts with mud. You need to understand something about your own instincts first, because they're about to betray you. When you picture ancient labor, your brain probably shows you chains, whips, rows of starving men dragging stone under threat of death, the Hollywood version, the Charlton Heston version, the version practically burned into Western memory by a single 1956 film. Feels true. It feels like it must be true because moving a 2.5-ton block by hand seems impossible without force. But here's what researchers actually found when they started digging in the wrong place on purpose. In 1990, a tourist's horse stumbled over a low mud brick wall just south of the Giza plateau. Not near the temples, not near the tombs of kings, but in the dust where nobody thought to look. What archaeologists Zahi Hawass and Mark Leaner pulled out of that ground over the next 2 decades wasn't a slave camp. It was a city, a real one. Bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves of bread a day. Breweries. A hospital, yes, a hospital with skeletons showing healed compound fractures and amputated limbs that had time to mend, meaning someone treated these workers, fed them, and let them recover. You do not build a hospital for people you intend to work to death and discard. Sit with that for a second. The workers who built the most famous tombs on Earth were, in many cases, better fed than the average Egyptian farmer. Isotope analysis of their bones, the chemical fingerprint locked into skeletons by what a person eats over years, shows diets rich in meat. Actual meat: cattle, sheep, goat. In a civilization where meat was a luxury, the pyramid builders were eating like it was a job worth keeping. And that's the part that should unsettle you, because it means the myth you grew up with, slaves under the whip, isn't just wrong. It's a distraction from something far stranger. These were skilled laborers, rotating in on shifts, organized into competitive work gangs with names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaure, who scratched graffiti into the stone blocks bragging about which team worked faster. Bragging, like a modern factory floor with a leaderboard on the wall. Here's your first modern-day gut check. Somewhere on your phone right now, there's an app tracking your steps, your screen time, your workout streak, gamifying effort the exact same way a 4,500-year-old work gang gamified hauling stone. The instinct to turn labor into competition, to name your team, to want a scoreboard, that's not a modern invention. That's apparently just what humans do when you give them hard work and a reason to care. You've been doing what pyramid builders did every time you've opened a fitness app. But competition explains motivation. It doesn't explain physics. And the physics is where the story gets genuinely disturbing in the best possible way. Picture the actual block. Not a picture in a textbook. The real thing, sitting on the sand at the edge of the quarry. It weighs as much as a fully loaded delivery truck. It has no wheels underneath it, no rollers, nothing but bare limestone touching bare sand. If you tried to drag it right now across dry desert sand, the friction would be so brutal that it would take dozens more men than the Egyptians actually used, and even then the block would dig itself a trench and stop. So here's the piece that took 3,000 years and one obsessive Egyptian tomb painting to figure out. In the tomb of a nobleman named Jehuti-Hotep, there's a wall painting, not a photograph, a painting, made around 1900 BCE, showing a massive statue being dragged on a wooden sledge by dozens of men in perfect rows. And standing right at the front of the sledge, almost too small to notice unless you're really looking, is a single man, pouring liquid onto the sand directly in front of the runners. For centuries, nobody knew what he was doing. Some assumed it was ceremonial, a ritual offering. But here's what researchers actually found when a team of Dutch physicists at the University of Amsterdam finally decided to test it properly in a lab in 2014. That man wasn't performing a ritual. He was doing physics. Wet sand, added in the exact right quantity, creates capillary bridges between sand grains, microscopic bonds of water tension that stiffen the surface and cut friction by roughly half. That single detail, one man, one jug of water poured at exactly the right moment, could be the difference between a sledge that glides and a sledge that doesn't move at all. The physicists calculated that wetting the sand in front of the sledge could cut the number of haulers needed nearly in two. Not because the Egyptians had modern chemistry, because someone, generations before Jehuti-Hotep's tomb was even painted, had noticed, through nothing but trial, error, and paying close attention to what worked, that wet sand behaved differently under a heavy load than dry sand did. Think about what that means. There was no lab, no formula, no scientist writing anything down in the language you'd recognize as science. Just someone standing at a construction site 4,500 years ago, watching a sledge drag through the sand, and thinking, what if I try wetting the ground first? And it worked, and it got passed down. And it ended up painted onto a tomb wall 1,000 years later because it still worked and still mattered, and nobody wanted to lose that knowledge to time. That's not primitive. That's the scientific method with no name attached to it. Now here's your second modern gut check, and it's an uncomfortable one. You live in an era that treats ancient as a synonym for unsophisticated. You've probably scrolled past a video with a title like this one. How did they do it without modern tools? Half expecting the answer to be a cheat code, a secret, a piece of lost technology that makes ancient people finally make sense to you. But the actual answer is scarier than a cheat code. The actual answer is that they were simply paying more attention than we usually give them credit for. And that should make you wonder what you're not paying attention to right now in your own life because you've decided it's too simple to matter. But wet sand only solves the dragging. It doesn't explain the part that should really be bothering you. The Pyramid of Khufu is 481 feet tall. This base covers 13 acres. It contains an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks, some weighing as much as 9 tons, and Egyptologists estimate the whole structure went up in roughly 20 years. That's a block, on average, placed and positioned every few minutes, for 2 decades straight, without a single mechanical crane. So how do you lift 2 million tons of stone into the sky using nothing but sledges, rope, and sweat? This is where you need to stop imagining ancient Egypt and start imagining ancient Egypt's logistics network. Because the lifting problem was never really solved by lifting. It was solved by walking uphill. The leading theory, and the one gaining the most physical evidence, is the ramp. Not one ramp, a system of them. Straight ramps for the lower courses, where the pyramid is wide and squat and there's room to build a long, gently sloped road of packed rubble and clay leading straight up the face. But as the pyramid rises, the base narrows, and a straight ramp long enough to reach the top would have needed more material than the pyramid itself. So the theory shifts to spiral ramps, wrapping around the outside of the structure like a staircase built from debris, each level slightly steeper, hugging the corners as the workers climbed. And in 2018, a team working at the Hatnub Quarry, the source of much of the fine alabaster used in temples and tombs, found something that turned theory into physical proof. A ramp, flanked by 2 staircases with regularly spaced post holes, dated to the exact era of the Great Pyramid's construction. Workers, the evidence suggests, used rope wound around wooden posts set into those holes, leverage points, essentially letting a relatively small crew haul weight up a steep incline using the posts as anchor points, multiplying their pulling force the same way a modern rock climber uses an anchor to haul gear up a cliff face. Rope, wood, posts, angles. That's the whole secret. Not magic. Mechanical advantage discovered through repetition, refined over generations, deployed at a scale that still makes modern engineers uneasy to calculate. But here's what you're not being told in most explainer videos, and it's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Nobody has ever found a definitive ramp for the upper third of the Great Pyramid. Not one. Egyptologists have theories: internal spiral ramps hidden inside the structure, external ramps later dismantled and their material reused, or ramps steep enough that some of the workforce was hauling material at grades that would exhaust a modern athlete. The truth is, for the final 150 feet of the tallest building humans would construct for the next 3,800 years, we are still genuinely guessing. Let that sit for a second. You are living in an age of satellites that can read a license plate from orbit, and there is a solid stone monument 15 minutes outside Cairo whose exact construction method for its top third remains, formally, unresolved. What you're about to hear was hidden, not deliberately, not in some conspiracy sense, but buried under 100 years of assumptions so confidently repeated that it hardened into fact. For most of the 20th century, the dominant story of the pyramids wasn't built on papyrus or bones or post holes. It was built on Greek tourism. A historian named Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 BCE, 2,000 years after Khufu's reign, further from the pyramids in time than you are from the fall of Rome, and wrote down what his tour guides told him. Slaves, 100,000 of them, whipped into the desert for 20 years. Herodotus wasn't lying. He was reporting what he was told by guides who, by his own time, had lost the actual institutional memory of how the pyramids were built and were filling the gap the way tour guides sometimes still do, with a good story instead of an uncertain one. And that second-hand, twice-removed account became the seed of nearly every pyramid myth that followed. It's the version Hollywood filmed. It's the version that made ancient aliens feel plausible to some people, because if you believe the only way to move stone is through cruelty and brute force, then something as precise and enormous as the Great Pyramid starts to feel like it needs an explanation beyond human effort. But the workers' cemetery at Giza, the hospital, the bakeries, the meat-rich diets, the team names scratched proudly into stone, that evidence didn't exist for Herodotus. It was buried under sand for another 2,400 years, waiting for a stumbling horse in 1990 to finally kick it loose. The truth had been sitting 8 feet under the ground the entire time, quietly contradicting a story that had already calcified into cultural memory. This is where the story stops being about Egypt and starts being about you. Because you do this too. You inherit a version of events from a movie, a viral post, a confident stranger online, and you let it calcify into fact without ever checking whether the ground underneath it has already shifted. Somewhere right now, you are carrying at least one belief that is doing exactly what the slave labor myth did to the pyramids for 2,000 years. Sounding true, feeling true, and being built entirely on secondhand tourism. And this is where Mirror comes back in, because his diary is the closest thing archaeology has ever found to a direct rebuttal, written by someone who was actually there instead of visiting 2 millennia later. His logbook, found in that cave at Wadi al-Jarf, doesn't read like propaganda or a monument inscription meant to glorify a king. It reads like a tired man's timesheet. Day by day, month by month, Mirror records his crew hauling limestone blocks by boat down the Nile from the quarries at Tura to the Giza Plateau, tracking food rations, describing a canal system connected to an artificial harbor near the pyramid itself. A harbor that modern excavation has since actually located, buried under what is now dry desert, exactly where Mirror said it would be. Read that again. A 4,500-year-old diary described a harbor. Archaeologists went looking. They found it. Underneath sand that has covered it for millennia, in a spot no map or memory had preserved except one man's ink on papyrus, describing his own commute. This isn't a monument boasting about a god-king's power. This is a middle manager complaining, in effect, about logistics, how many days a shipment took, how the crew was fed, how the schedule slipped, and how it recovered. It is the most mundane document imaginable, and that mundanity is exactly why it's the most trustworthy thing we have. Nobody exaggerates a supply chain report for propaganda. Mirror wasn't writing for history. He was writing so his supervisor would know the blocks arrived on time. And that changes the entire emotional shape of this story. Doesn't it? You came in imagining screaming overseers and collapsing bodies in the sun. What you're getting instead is a functioning, fed, organized, seasonally rotating workforce moving stone down a river using a canal system so sophisticated that modern engineers, when they finally mapped it, described it as the kind of civil infrastructure you'd expect from a state capable of large-scale, coordinated public works, not a chaotic mass of forced, unskilled labor. Here's your third modern connection, and it's the one that should actually stay with you the longest. The Nile, during flood season, rises and floods the farmland that most Egyptians depended on for their livelihood, which means for roughly 3 or 4 months a year, the agricultural workforce of the entire nation had nothing to farm and no income coming in. Some Egyptologists now believe the pyramid workforce wasn't a permanent slave class at all, but seasonal labor, farmers who, when the floodwaters made their fields useless, took government-fed work hauling stone for the state. The same way, in your own life, someone laid off from one job takes seasonal work at a warehouse during the holidays to keep the lights on. The pyramids, under this theory, weren't just tombs. They were an economic engine, a 4,500-year-old public works program, keeping an entire seasonal workforce fed, organized, and employed during the exact months they would otherwise have had nothing. You've lived through a version of this without realizing it every single time you've heard a politician promise infrastructure jobs as an economic strategy. The idea isn't new. It's one of the oldest ideas humans have ever had. It's just wearing a different name. But even seasonal, fed, organized labor doesn't explain the number that should actually be bothering you the most, and we've been circling it this entire time without saying it out loud. 20 years. 2.3 million blocks. That's a block placed on average every few minutes around the clock for 2 decades. A manufacturing and logistics tempo that some modern construction engineers, when shown the numbers cold, have called effectively impossible without motorized equipment. And that's the reveal researchers have been circling for a century without a clean answer. The numbers only work if the entire operation was running multiple parallel systems simultaneously. Quarrying at Tura and Aswan, boat transport down the Nile, canal delivery to the harbor, ramp hauling on site, and precision leveling and placement, all running at once, continuously, coordinated across a supply chain stretching hundreds of miles, with margins for error small enough that the base of the Great Pyramid is level to within about 2 centimeters across its entire 13-acre footprint. 2 centimeters. Across 13 acres. With no laser levels. No satellites. No modern surveying equipment. How? The leading theory involves something almost embarrassingly simple: water. Workers likely cut a grid of shallow trenches around the perimeter of the base, flooded them, and used the water's naturally flat surface as a universal reference line. The same physics your grandfather used with a bubble level, just scaled up to the size of a football stadium. Water doesn't care how ancient you are. It's always level. And if you're clever enough to use that fact at massive scale, you don't need modern technology. You need modern level thinking, applied with ancient patience. Patience is the word that should be echoing in your head right now, because here's the part of the story that finally gets disturbing. Not in a jump scare way, but in the way a fact can quietly rearrange how you see your own life. You live in a culture engineered for instant results. You expect a package tomorrow. You expect an answer in seconds. You get frustrated at a loading icon. And somewhere under the sand at Giza is a monument built by people who planned in units of decades, who accepted that the top third of a 481-foot structure might never be fully explained to the people who'd inherit it, and who built anyway, block by block, harbor trip by harbor trip, flood season by flood season, without ever seeing the finished thing from a distance the way you can, right now, on your phone in under a second via satellite image. They built something they could barely imagine finished, using knowledge passed down with no guarantee it would survive, on a timeline longer than most modern careers, and it's still standing. Meanwhile, you've probably abandoned a plan this month because it would take longer than expected. So here's the truth, sitting quietly underneath everything you've just heard, and it's stranger than any alien theory could ever be. The pyramids weren't built by lost technology, forgotten superhumans, or forces from outside history. They were built by people who were remarkably, almost uncomfortably, like you, competitive, hungry for recognition, capable of noticing small physical details like wet sand under a sledge, organized into shifting economic systems that solved unemployment the same way modern governments still try to, and willing to commit to something so large they'd never see its full effect in their own lifetime. The wheel was never the missing piece. You were. Every time you've watched a video looking for the cheat code, The secret trick, the shortcut, the piece of lost knowledge that would finally explain the impossible. The pyramids have been sitting there for 4,500 years quietly telling you the same thing Mirror's diary tells you in his exhausted, unglamorous handwriting. There was no trick. There was attention. There was repetition. There was a willingness to pour water on sand and notice that it worked, and do it again tomorrow, and the day after, for 20 years, until something taller than anything else on Earth was standing where there used to be nothing but a flat plateau and a plan. Next time you're staring at your phone, waiting for a video to load, frustrated by 3 seconds of buffering, somewhere under that same sky a monument is still standing that took 2 decades to build with rope, water, and rock, and it's outlasted every empire, every language, and every myth that's ever tried to explain it away. The wheel was never missing. Your patience might be.